Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Writer's Chat, where we just like to talk about things writing and share tips and encourage each other. This is really a highlight of Tuesdays for a lot of us in the community, and we're just so excited that you're here either live or watching the replay, because today is going to be so exciting. We are talking about fiction and conflict, and I'm just super thrilled about our guests. So I'm going to turn this over to Melissa to introduce him.
Hey everybody, and I'm very pleased to welcome back Scott Rutherford, who's been with us before as a guest, and today he's going to be talking about creating conflict in layers for fiction. And I have to kind of I have to figure out my screen share here first, but I got to kind of brag on him just a little bit, because he sent me this media kit and it is just really cool. I don't know if you guys can see this. Has it all popped up for you guys? All right. So this is the media kit for his novel that just came out this September. Is that right, Scott?
That is correct. And I do need to correct myself a little bit. I told you that my wife created this, and she did a lot of it. She did the cover, but also Touchpoint Presses. We had an intern actually who did a lot of the media kit. So I want to make sure that credit goes where credit is due there.
Okay.
His name is also Scott.
Well, this is awesome. I think this is so well put together, and you guys are seeing this. I know that you're enjoying this too. It just flows. It works so well. And so we're coming down here. There's the description of the book, and I'll give Scott a chance to tell a little bit more about that and where you can find the book and check it out. Here we got Meet Scott Rutherford. Scott is a debut author and has split his life between Michigan's Tri-Cities, Bay City, Saginaw, Midland, and Shreveport, Louisiana. A husband and father of two, Rutherford currently lives in Freeland, Michigan, on a farm that has been in his wife's family since the late 1800s. That's pretty cool. He is helping his father-in-law restore the farm to operational status while going back to school, double majoring in secondary education and French. A former youth pastor and home missionary, Rutherford served from 2014 to 2018 as staff writer, faith and family editor, managing editor, and executive editor of Metro Leader, a family of hyper-local monthly news journals published throughout Louisiana and Texas. During that time, his editorials were delivered to more than 1 million homes per month. Rutherford has ghostwritten numerous books. He contributed research and drafts to A Quick View Guide, The Most Significant People, Places, and Events in the Bible by Christopher D. Hudson, published by Zondervan. He has served as a writing coach and editor for several projects. Rutherford is particularly proud of co-authoring a primer on power, discovering the dynamic ministry of the Holy Spirit, with Dr. Scott Camp, the evangelist and Bible college professor who led him to faith in Jesus Christ in 1988, when he was a 17-year-old from a broken home struggling with depression. A primer on power has been translated into several languages and is currently seeing use as a Bible college text in India, Vietnam, and Ghana. When he's not writing, Rutherford enjoys spending time with family, studying history and foreign languages, and playing the drums. So thank you and welcome, Scott. That is just really cool.
Very, very cool. And we actually have Isabel with us today, and she's in France right now. So people are in the chat, I know she's there.
Bonjour. Bonjour, Isabel.
Yay! Maybe in the after party you guys can speak French to each other. That would be so fun to listen to.
Oh, I'm afraid I would probably embarrass myself, but I'm getting there, but I've got a ways to go.
How fun! All right, welcome. All right, Scott, take it away. Tell us what we need to know.
Well, all right. So we're talking about conflict, and conflict can at times be a difficult subject to address because in normal life, not the author's life, but normal life, I think we're all kind of trained to kind of avoid conflict or to manage conflict. But our job as writers is quite the opposite. We need to create conflict, and we need to create a lot of it. And it needs to be significant enough and serious enough that it keeps somebody wanting to turn pages. Conflict, and I'm hardly the first person to say this, but conflict is what makes fiction go. It's the gas. Without conflict, you don't have a story. You can have the greatest, most well thought out characters in the world, and they can be the most interesting man on earth, to borrow something from the commercials. But if you don't have conflict, you don't have a story. Conflict should come into your story on page 1, scene 1, and preferably sentence 1 or even word 1. Right from after chapter 1, you want to introduce conflict. Now, to be clear, it doesn't have to, in most cases, probably shouldn't be the main conflict of the story, but there should be conflict. One of my mentors, Jerry Jenkins, often says, and I believe he got this from Stephen King, you want to plunge your character into terrible trouble right away. I mean, you want to start with an interesting character and plunge him or her right into terrible trouble right on the first page. If not, you generally won't get a reader in, particularly your gateway readers, your acquisitions editors, and your agents. A lot of times they won't get to page 2 if you haven't hooked them with some kind of a problem on page 1, some kind of conflict. And think about it in your own reading. I mean, if you're just reading if there's not a conflict, if there's not something to make you care about the character, you're not going to stick with it. Not only should it start on page 1, scene 1, and sentence 1, but it should be in every scene in your novel. I've heard it said often that every scene should do one of two things. It should either present conflict or it should reveal character. And I think that's mostly right, but I think a lot of people get one word wrong. I think you need to take the word "or" right out of there. You need to take a red pen and X right through it and just razor blade, cut it out. Just the word "or," take it out of there. It should be "and." Every scene should present conflict and reveal character. And I would go so far as to say you can't reveal character without conflict. Or if you do, the only really other way to do it is to do an information dump. And that's just not something that today's readers are generally willing to put up with. There are some genres in which it's a little more acceptable than others, but particularly about your characters, you don't want to spend page after page telling your reader what the character is like. You want to show them, in the way you show a person's characters, you show them in conflict. And think about it, it's that way in real life too. You want to know who your friends are. See who's your friend when they're going through conflict or when you're going through conflict. When there's problems, and that's true in fiction. Fiction is just basically real life amplified and put under a microscope. And it's very much a truth that conflict is what reveals character every time. Now, the other thing, and this is something I see a lot in amateur writers, a lot of them feel like the conflict has to be resolved by the end of the scene. Whatever conflict they've introduced into a scene has to be resolved by the end of that scene. And nothing can be further from the truth. Matter of fact, you're better off. You want to start your scenes with conflict. You're better off if you're also ending your scenes with still some unresolved conflict. Now, it doesn't mean you don't ever resolve, because obviously then you don't have a story either. You just have melodrama. But you do want to leave a scene with something to keep people turning pages. Either that conflict still ongoing or a new conflict that's introduced. I think of a scene in my book that I really like where the young lady who's the protagonist is bringing a guy over for dinner, and who hasn't been through that in their life, where you're introducing a date to your parents for the first time, and in her case, her father is a Marine, and so he has a lot of those tendencies, and her boyfriend is a rock singer. So we've got two very different people, which is one of the ways you can create conflict, and we'll get into that more later. But you have two very different people, and they're getting ready to clunk heads. And of course, the character Danny wants Dad to be impressed by this guy. And John, of course, wants to make a good impression too. And they do resolve that conflict. But the way they do it introduces a new conflict, because John, towards the end of it, when Dad looks at him and says, well, are you ever going to get a real job? He says, well, yeah, I was going to give my band another year, and if it doesn't make it, I want to join the Marines. And so all of a sudden, Dad's an ally, and and they're starting to get along, and they find a way to connect. Well, Danny's lived her whole life in the Marine Corps, and she doesn't want to live in the Marine Corps. So it introduces an entirely new conflict. By the end of the scene, you have Danny and John arguing about whether the Marine Corps really is an acceptable path. And I just say that is illustrative of one way that you can flow from one conflict into another. The conflict should be part of every scene. It should generally rise through the climax of your book. Of course, you want to start with smaller conflicts and you build toward the greater in the end, but it doesn't need to be in a straight line. It's okay for your conflict to have peaks and to have valleys, and to go through times where one type of conflict is greater, and to introduce subplots that ramp up the conflict. And there's just so many different ways that you can do it. But the one thing that writers need to really know, particularly beginning writers, is when it comes to conflict with your characters, don't be afraid to pile it on. We tend to get very connected with our characters, and we were talking about this actually before the show a little bit, but I think most of us as writers, I mean, these fictional characters almost become real people to us, and in some cases they almost become more real than the three-dimensional people that we deal with in real life, and we kind of fall in love with them. And when we do that, sometimes it can, I mean, have you ever found yourself writing and you realize, hey, I'm crying because of what this character is going through? That's a good thing. I mean, another thing one of my mentors says is, if there's no tears in the writer, there won't be any in the reader. So you want that, but as a writer, it can be very tempting to want to pull back and to not put them through too much. And I think that's a very natural thing. And even reading back through my book now, it's been released for about a month, and of course, I still will flip through it. And there's a couple of places in the books where I thought I pulled back and I shouldn't have. And then I think, oh, but I couldn't have done this other thing. I couldn't have put this one more thing on her, but I probably should have. And we need to not be afraid to pile it on. There's a commercial that I really like. Maybe some of you have seen it. It was for, I think, Bush's baked beans, but it was for beans at any rate. And they were talking about, well, how much brown sugar do you put in the beans? And they said, well, you keep pouring until your conscience won't allow you to do any more. And then you put a little bit more in. And that's what we should do with conflict. Conflict is what makes your story go. So in every scene, in every part of your book, keep pouring in conflict until your conscience just won't let you do it anymore. And then dig in deep and cram just a little bit more conflict into that scene. Trust me on this. The more conflict, the better. You want to avoid, of course, the danger of getting cartoonish with it. But most of the time, writers make the opposite mistake, where they pull short rather than adding really as much conflict. And especially if you're finding that your writing is flat, too much conflict is not the problem. You need to add more. So don't be afraid to pile it on. It's a secret ingredient that makes fiction go. And don't be afraid to add it from multiple sources. Conflict is one of those wonderful things that it can come from all kinds of places. I mean, kind of the low-hanging fruit, we think of, okay, in our story, we've got maybe a protagonist and an antagonist, and of course they're going to create conflict for one another. But the conflict doesn't necessarily have to come from a villain or an antagonist. Conflict can come from your friends. I mean, think of it in life, how much of your conflict really comes from somebody that's your enemy. Most of us don't have that many true enemies in life that are just twirling their mustaches and trying to figure out how to foil our plans. we get more conflict from our family, from our friends, from people who more or less are headed the same direction that we are, but maybe think, maybe don't agree on how to get there. And so don't be afraid to add conflict between your characters that are allies. Another thing, failure adds conflict. Let your characters fail. If your character goes through the book from page 1 to the end succeeding, you haven't created conflict. There was a series that I read when I was a really young man, and I did enjoy the series, and I won't name it because I'm going to say some negative things about it. But when I was kind of younger, I enjoyed it, but the older I got, the less I liked it, and I couldn't understand why. The characters were the same, so why wasn't I enjoying this? But as I was maturing and wanting stories that were a little deeper, I noticed that this character never failed. And it was a Christian author. The guy never had a moral dilemma. He succeeded at everything he tried to do. And at a certain point, it became a cartoon. And so you need to be willing to let your characters fall on their face. You need to be willing to let them flail. You need to be willing to let life assault them from every direction. Because those are the things that your readers are going to really latch onto and they're going to really relate to. Don't be afraid to put your babies into some dark places. Now, the other thing that you want to be careful about when you're creating conflict, every writer should be familiar with the concept of the crucible. And I didn't make this up. I first heard it from James Frey, who wrote a series of books about how to write a darn good novel. And that wasn't the word he used, but I won't use his word because I don't use those words. But at any rate, he wrote that series, and he had some excellent things to say about making sure that your characters are in what he called the crucible. What that means is he said you need to make sure you're not creating a situation with your conflict where your reader is going to say, well, why doesn't Joey just walk away? Why don't they just get away from this situation? For example, maybe your story has to do with office politics, and somebody's just in a terrible job and everybody is after them and everything's going poorly. And if it gets to the point where readers are saying, well, why doesn't he just quit? Then you've got a problem. Well, how you avoid that is you put them in the crucible. Okay, yeah, it's a terrible job, but where else is he going to make $120,000 a year with a high school diploma? He's got 6 kids, 3 dogs to feed. His wife's father owns the company, so he can't just walk away without creating problems. Membership in the military is a great crucible. Okay, so if it's a war story, okay, guys might want to get out of there, but that's usually not an option. Something's holding them there. Maybe your story is talking about a bad marriage or struggles within a marriage. But the character is a Christian and they don't believe in just easily walking away from a marriage. There's all kinds of things that you can do, but you want to make sure that the forces that are keeping them in the conflict are as strong as the conflict, because otherwise the only thing that would make sense would be for your characters to walk away from it. And so what you need to make sure your characters are thoroughly motivated so that they'll stay in the fight. And that really leads us to the main thrust of what you can do to create conflict in your novel. The first thing that you need to do, the first thing that you need to ask yourself when you're creating a story is, what does my character want most of all? What is it it may not even be where the story is going to, but what does that character want? What, more than anything in the world, what's the big story question? What's the big thing that they're trying to do? And to take an example, movies are good to take examples from because when you go books, maybe everybody hasn't read them, but you take like a Star Wars. What's the big goal? They want to defeat the Empire. Well, there's a lot of smaller goals in between, but the big goal is they want to, they want to defeat the Empire. Luke Skywalker wants to join the rebellion. That's the big thing that he wants to do. And then for every scene, you need to ask yourself, okay, what does my point of view character want right now in this scene? And those aren't always the same thing, and those change. And they can even change in the middle of the scene, just kind of depending on how things go. I mean, sticking with the Star Wars example, I don't know if we've all seen Star Wars, hopefully. If not, it was this little movie in the 70s. A few people have seen it anyway. But one of their goals, they want to get to the planet of Alderaan because the princess has asked them to come and join them for help. So their goal is to get to Alderaan, and they go through all these different things, and they get to Alderaan and it's been blown up. Well, all of a sudden we need to change goals. Alderaan's not there. And that in and of itself is a source of conflict. But the other, of course, we need to know what the point of view character wants. We also need to know what all of the other characters in the scene want. Motivation is the primary driver of conflict, because your conflict is going to come from anything that comes in between your characters really, and what they want. What is it they want, and what comes between it? It can be another character that comes between them. It can be a natural circumstance that comes between them. It can be society that comes between them. And we can all get on the computer and Google how to create conflict and come up with lists of all the different things that can create conflict. But the short answer is conflict can be anything that gets in between one of your characters and what they want.
I've got a question for you.
All right, go ahead.
Here. So for those of us who are sort of new to fiction writing, what if your character hasn't told you what their goal is? like how do you figure out what that overarching goal is if you just have sort of this small insight into the character at the point very early on in the book?
Well, usually I start with the conflict and I come up with a character from the conflict.
Okay.
Me personally, but you can do it the other way around. I've done it the other way around before. What I will do if I don't know what a character really wants, if I don't know that, then I don't know enough about the character to write the character yet. Mm-hmm. And so what I will do is I will journal, and I'll do it in the first person, usually as if I'm the character. And I will start from I was born, and right from the beginning of their life, and kind of take it through there, okay? And usually when somebody tells you their life story, or when you're telling a life story like that, at some point it will become obvious. It'll become obvious what they want. If it doesn't, then we need to ask ourselves, do we have a story with this character? And I don't mean to kind of be a downer there, but we have to ask ourselves, is this really main character material if we don't have a motivation? But I think one of the ways you can find that motivation is just to write. Another thing that I'll do sometimes, if I'm really not sure what's making my character tick, is I'll write a short story with that character that has nothing to do with the book that I'm writing, but it's just kind of a short story and puts them in a situation. And when I can see the character, how they react in the situation, that begins to help me realize what makes the character tick, what's important to them, what is it that's fueling them and driving them to try to get somewhere. And as far as what the character wants, it's important to know what motivates them, but also it's important to realize that can change over the course of a story. If you think of romance, most of the, and I love to read romance. I mean, I know that's a little atypical for a guy, but I do it as a matter of study, because romance writers, they know pacing. Even if you're a writer, read at least a few romance novels, because you'll learn a lot about pacing. You'll learn a lot about motivation. And you'll learn a lot about how a character's motivation can change. Because usually, the ones that I've read anyway, the protagonist goes in kind of resisting the idea of love entirely, or certainly they don't want to be entangled with who they eventually end up with. And that motivation kind of changes somewhere along the line. And so it's important to know not just the character's surface motivation, but what do they really want. And to understand that, I think you kind of have to put your psychologist cap on and put your characters on the couch there for a little while sometimes, because sometimes you need to dig at what do they really want when they might not even know what they really want yet. And how human is that? How real is that?
Yeah.
Because how many of us even know what we really want? How many of us want the same thing that we wanted 5 years ago? Other than to be published. I think we all, for writers, that remains a constant. But for most of us, our motivations change. And it's okay for your character's motivation to change. You do need to know what the big thing they want is in your book, though, because otherwise, all you have is a character. You need conflict plus character leading to a resolution in order to have a full story.
Oh, that's really good. And yeah, Melissa, you're gonna go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to address the question, and I also had a comment just to add to that. I find that it's helpful to ask the what if question. If you're completely lost, ask, what if this happened to him? Or what's the worst thing I could do to this character? And then explore those possibilities. And it's amazing the ideas that just start popping in your head, just throwing things at them for fun. Whether you use it all or not, it just kind of gets the brainstorming going. And so I like to ask the what if. Like, I have a character who he's out on vengeance. Well, what caused him to be all vengeful in the first place? Well, what if his close family member died? Well, and we found out another family member caused that death. Boom, we've got instant conflict. And this character, what if this character did it to get at his mom? And so then I just started exploring all of these things, and it made things so much deeper, and the character deeper, and the conflict drove. And so, yeah, just asking the what if question, I think, is a good method of exploration there.
I think that's excellent. I think that's something we need to do for all of our characters. I think we need to not just do that for the protagonist and the antagonist, but really, if there's a character in your book and he's doing anything beyond just waiting on the table and walking away, you need to know enough about that character to know why he or she is there, what he or she wants. If you can't say that, your characters are going to come across flat. And it's amazing to me how many times in my own experience, when a scene's coming across flat, it's usually because the secondary characters are coming across flat. And it's usually because I haven't put in the time and the effort to really flesh out those characters and to understand who they are and what they want. So put some time into more than just your main character. Know who their friends are, who their enemies are, and know what they want. And be careful that you don't. One of the biggest amateur mistakes that can be made is to make where your antagonists are villains and they're bad just because they're evil. In most fiction, it really doesn't work, and most readers want something a little deeper than that. I mean, it maybe works for Saturday morning cartoon. Well, when Saturday morning cartoons were a thing, but it doesn't. A Snidely Whiplash or a Gargamel who are just evil because they're evil. I mean, that doesn't really work for most readers. We want to see villains who are real people too, who have, as I believe it was Melissa said, who have that wound or who have that conflict within themselves. As far as conflict with a villain goes, one of my favorites. Hopefully, we're all at least vaguely familiar with Les Miserables. And if not with the book itself, matter of fact, skip the book, watch the movie. French writing, if you're not really into French writing, it spends a lot of time going down rabbit trails, especially Victor Hugo. But there's a scene towards the end where the antagonist, and he's one of the greatest antagonists, as far as I'm concerned, in all literature, because he's convinced he's right. He's convinced he's righteous and he's doing the right thing by clamping down on criminals. And the fact that a criminal is just trying to get some bread to eat doesn't matter to him. But he comes face to face with that conflict at the end, and it drives him mad to the point that he throws himself into the river. It just, but what wonderful conflict. My sense of justice, and all of a sudden, I see what mercy can do, and I can't reconcile the two. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a wonderful example of internal conflict, which we should probably, at this point, get to what the different types of conflict are in how we layer them. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, there's just one question that kind of springboards off that, and I think it would get right into it. Kathy asked a question earlier. Here, it scrolled up and I lost it, so I have to find it again. She said, Scott, do you ever let your characters take a breath, or do you keep your conflict continuous?
Every once in a while, it's good to tease your readers by letting them think you're going to let them take a breath for a minute, but only if you're getting ready to slam them. They don't get a breath until the end, when we're wrapping it up in this resolution where they can finally breathe. And I can't say that's what should happen 100% of the time, but most of the time, no. If you're starting to feel pity for your characters, go take some mean pills or something, and you need to keep hammering them, and you need to hammer them until you're sure they're going to break, because then the readers are going to be sure they're going to break, and then when the triumph comes and they get through whatever it is, that's when the real. You don't want to give them relief before it's time for relief. Now, that's not to say you can't give them a temporary reprieve or let them overcome some of their smaller conflicts along the way. But as soon as you do, hammer them with something else. Keep the pressure coming. I mean, when you're writing, think of you as a writer. Think of the year 2020. This year has been one thing after another. This year would make wonderful fiction. Historical fiction writers are going to have an absolute picnic with this year 50 years from now. At this point, I think it's all fresh enough that I don't know that we find it funny, but there will come a time where someone says, yeah, I wouldn't believe 2020 if it were written. That's true. You can't mirror real life too much, because real life can be too bizarre for fiction. But even still, I think 2020 for younger writers someday will make a very good setting. Did that answer the question?
I think so.
Okay. So anyway, multi-layer conflict. When you're getting to write a scene, ask yourself, okay, what does my character want overall? Because we always have to be keeping in mind, what is my character's big goal? Then ask, what does my character want right now in this scene? And that question we need to be asking throughout the scene, because it might change. I mean, think for a minute, say a young mother needs to get milk for her baby. And she realizes she doesn't have any money, so she stops at the ATM machine. Well, she's just 2 steps away, and she steps out of the car, and the baby's sleeping, so she doesn't want to disturb him. Her goal is to get milk. That's what's going on for her. And after she gets the money back and she comes off, she realizes to her horror, she left the keys in the car and the car door is locked. Well, how many know getting milk is no longer all that important, or at least not first thing on the mind of that young mother? Now we have a baby in the car. Okay, well, now maybe a thunderstorm comes up. Okay, now we've got another layer of conflict. That this, be ready to keep asking, okay, does their goal change? Because that will have an impact on the conflict. Maybe, okay, now the young mother's there and now somebody else shows up and wants to lecture her about leaving her baby in the car. Another layer of conflict. Doesn't mean the lecturer isn't completely right, but it's a layer of conflict. So what does every character in my scene want? And if a character doesn't want anything in the scene, they don't belong in the scene. They're not adding anything. Ideally, what everybody wants should be at least a little bit different. You shouldn't have any two characters that want exactly the same thing in exactly the same way. It's okay for them to be on the same side, but if you've ever been on a team of any sort, you know that, or if you've ever been in a marriage or a relationship, you know that wanting some of the same things doesn't mean that you don't have conflicts in getting there and how you're going to get there. So then you want to ask yourself, okay, with the off-screen characters, it's a good idea to ask yourself, what's their big goal? Know what every character's goal is, but also what do they want in this scene? What are they doing here? What are they trying to accomplish? How does it mess things up for my point of view character? But of course, other characters are not your only source of conflict. You can also have just natural obstacles get in the way. In the case of the mother with the car is a natural obstacle. The car doesn't want anything from the scene. The car doesn't care. The car is still an obstacle. And there can be all sorts of things. There can be social things. Somebody's fired from their job. Well, the job doesn't really care, but that's a source of conflict. What are the source of conflict? What is really grinding on your character? What do the on-screen characters want? Also, is there any conflict that we can throw into this scene that relates to off-screen characters? Just because a character isn't on screen at the moment doesn't mean that they're not in your character's head. I mean, I'm going to tell on myself a little bit because we all have different ways of resolving conflict. Mine is to grumble and get away. And now, when I've had arguments with my wife, which we've been married almost 30 years, so it's happened a couple of times. She was right both times, but my way of dealing with that usually is to walk away, get in the car, whatever, and just grumble. Well, I could drive 100 miles away, and there's still conflict. My wife would no longer be in that scene, but she would be, because the conflict is still there. In the case of my novel, Danny's Inferno, okay, the dad is not always in the scene, but he is always in the scene, because when there's conflict between them, there's conflict. And my wife is clowning, but she's right. She is usually right. The setting itself, does the setting itself add conflict? Is the character someplace that they really don't want to be? Job is a good one for that. I mean, we're at a job, they can't leave the job because they need the paycheck, they need the money or whatever. The setting itself is a source of conflict. Characters whitewater rafting and they go over and into the water. The setting itself creates a conflict. The character wants to breathe, the setting would rather drown them. Not that in the case of a river, that a river has any feelings, but really when you're ramping up that conflict, it should almost seem like it does. And which one of us in life have not at some point felt like, gosh, the world is just out to get me today? I mean, how in the world can all these things go wrong? It's almost like someone's planning it, like I've got Wile E. Coyote chasing me or something. And to the point where at some point you almost back away and it's comical. But But that should be in your story too. It should seem like the whole world is just coming down on your character and just trying to ruin their day. The setting should add conflict whenever possible. If your setting is not adding some conflict, ask yourself, is there a way that the setting could add conflict? Is there something that I could do to make this a bigger problem? Going back to our example with the poor young mother who left her baby locked in the car, and she's frantic, and all of a sudden the heavens open up and it starts raining on her. That's an example of the setting itself ramping up the conflict and causing what on most days would only be a minor inconvenience. But if you're already frantic, getting rained on, and you're trying to figure a situation out, maybe she's trying to call the police and the phone shorts because it's getting rained on. You can't get reception in a storm or whatever. That's the setting causing conflict. And whenever possible, the setting should cause conflict. On-screen characters should cause conflict. Off-screen characters should cause conflict. And then on top of it all, your character should be dealing with internal conflict. Whenever possible, put your character in situations where they have to choose between two situations that are both bad. Where they just don't have a good answer, but they have to pick one or the other. Give them some internal conflict. Give them a to be or not to be moment. Give them situations where it's not always either not morally clear what to do. And specifically, and I don't know how much of the audience is Christian fiction writers, but I'll speak to that because that's kind of my genre. That's one of the biggest mistakes I find, even in published Christian books, is there's a lot of times there's just not a lot of moral dilemma for the characters. It always becomes clear to them what's right and what's wrong. And any of us that's lived life knows that it just doesn't work that way. We're faced with situations where we don't know what's right to do, and we don't know what we want to do. And your characters should have that kind of a situation, that kind of a dilemma. And so on top of that, conflict with the natural, conflict with the supernatural. Depending on your genre, your type of book, that may or may not factor in. But particularly, and here again, I go back to Christian fiction. I love writing stories about people who are new or immature Christians, because really any of us who are on that walk are immature to a degree. And you face so many moral dilemmas that might be clear to somebody else, but they're not clear to you. And you don't know whether to do, what you're supposed to do. And then sometimes even when we do know what we're supposed to do, we might even, you might know that God wants you to do something. Knowing it and doing it are not always the same thing. I think of the story in the Bible, and I trust it's okay to use a biblical story, but of the rich young ruler where Jesus told him, sell everything you have and give to the poor. Well, okay, he at that point had complete clarity on what he was supposed to do. Doing it was the problem. He faced a dilemma, and unfortunately in the story he made the wrong choice. We can hope that maybe later he changed his mind, but put your characters in those situations. Make them make hard choices. And I would even say make sure they get those choices wrong sometimes. Because getting things right does not add conflict and doesn't add story and doesn't develop your character. Every one of us knows that we've grown more through our failures than we'll ever grow through our successes. And that should be true of your fictional characters too. They should fail, but not fail forward, but they should fail. Yes, I like what Norma had to say. Yes, and I love that scripture. The things that I should do, I don't do. The things that I shouldn't do, I do. Because it shows that even the guys who wrote the Bible were in the same boat that we're in. So, multi-layered conflict. Consider what your character wants. Consider what you can put in their way. And gosh, an hour just is not as long as it seems. Consider what every other character in the scene wants. And if we can I want to demonstrate what that looks like. And this is mainly about how the method I use to really figure out, okay, if the scene's not as punchy as I want it to be, this is something that I use. I map out all the characters in a scene and what their motivations are, and I make it almost look kind of like a battle map. And so I'm going to let you look at my chicken scratch a little bit. And this is from a scene in my novel, Danny's Inferno. It is funny because when I look back at it, when I was looking through to find one like this, I couldn't remember for sure which scene this was because it could be 2 or 3 different scenes. but it'll help you. I think it'll help illustrate what I mean by multi-layered conflict, at least between the characters. So is that something that we can get up? I've got it on my screen now. If I move the, there we go.
Yep, and I wanted to say while you're getting that up, Josh had a question, so I wanted to go back and grab it real quick. And then we'll do this, and then we could probably around 12, as soon as this next part's done, go off the recording and then go bring everybody on if you guys want. This is
Sounds great.
This is so good, Scott. I've got 3 pages of notes. I'm going into page 4. Okay, so I want to make sure I got Josh's question in for the replay. And you kind of talked about this, but I want to make sure it was answered for Josh. Does every conflict need to be another character, or can it be a struggle in their own past or heart? So you really did cover that just now. So I just want to give Josh an opportunity in the chat. Like if you needed any more clarification, Josh, throw that in there, and then we'll have Scott answer that. But
okay, do you want me to hold off a minute on this then?
I think we covered it pretty well. So no, let's go ahead, and then we can have Josh come in on our after party too if he needs to. So I just want to make sure that if there were secondary questions, we got them answered too. So let's jump into this, and I'll watch the chat.
Okay, here's the scene. Okay, Danny is my main character, and you see right in the middle where I have a circle with her name on it, and inside the circle I've got just some notes on her internal conflicts. These aren't things that are going on outside. This is just what's inside her. One of her conflicts is she wants to be a daddy's girl. She wants to be a good girl. She wants to do the right thing. She's a Christian. But the verses is that she also wants to be well-liked. She wants to be, in particular with her on again, off again boyfriend. Another conflict is that she thinks she loves John, but she knows that the involvement in the band isn't good for either of them, so that creates a conflict, but he knows that he wants her to be involved in it.
Hey, Scott.
Yes.
Scott, your screen share isn't showing up. You have to go down to the bottom of the screen and choose share screen, and then we'll see what you're talking about.
Okay. I don't know if I brought it up correctly on, see, share screen.
And it should give you an option to choose your image that you are wanting to share after you click the share screen icon.
I don't see share screen, unfortunately.
It might be at the top. Sometimes it depends on what device you're on, whether it's at the bottom or the top.
Okay, reactions, record, share screen. Okay, right in front of me. Okay, there we go. There we go. Now can we see it?
Yes, now it's showing up for us.
All right, perfect. So you see where I've got Danny right in the middle there. And you probably can't read my writing. That's okay. You follow along, you get an idea. And then you see the other characters that are in circles. Those are characters that are on scene. Now, you don't have to use circles. You can, use whatever you want to use to represent. But then I've got arrows going in the direction of the conflict. And oftentimes they go both ways. Sometimes it's a one-way conflict. You see there's conflict and I try to look at, okay, every character, what conflict do they have with which other characters? And of course, you can see looking at this, it looks like it's an absolute mess. If you start mapping out all of your characters in what beefs and what problems and what motivational conflicts they have with other characters, it won't take long before it does look like a battle's taking place. It's an absolute disaster. Then in the square in the corners, we've got characters who are off screen but who are important. Basil up in the top left, he's a manager that wants to sign the band. He also has his own desire to hook up with Danny, which puts him in conflict with John. Cal, who is a good friend and also John's brother, would rather see Danny away from John because he knows his brother. He knows his brother's bad news. So there's conflict between them. And if you look at kind of the rainbow I have written between Cal and John, and they're on either, you see Danny's right in the middle of that conflict. Well, Cal thinks that John's a jerk. Well, John thinks that Cal needs to mind his own business. And so when they get into this scene together, when you go to write a scene, it helps to have all these things in mind of what everybody wants. And it's especially helpful with your peripheral characters, because otherwise peripheral characters, if you're not careful, will just kind of hang out and become part of the background. And that's what you don't want to happen. You want all of your characters to be three-dimensional, and the way that we show that three-dimensionalism is through what their motivations are and what conflicts that brings to the scene, as seen through the point of view character's eyes. Now, of course, all of these conflicts won't necessarily actively be part of what you write down, but it's amazing how much when you're writing what somebody says, when you have in mind what that person wants, it's almost uncanny how much more it comes to life. Even if it's not even in the words themselves, it becomes more natural to write a character like a real person. And now how do I let's go with stop share. And anybody who wants that, I mean, it's not on loose leaf paper, it's nothing fancy, but I can certainly make that available for anybody that wants that. Or, gosh, I can't do it for everybody, but I'd be happy to go through a couple people and do scenes and kind of figure out how you would map that out. Matter of fact, we talked about that. Do we still have time? I know we're getting kind of close.
We are getting kind of close. We're at 11:58. If we want to, why don't we go maybe another 5 minutes, and then we'll turn off the replay, and then Scott, we'll have the people who are live with us, they can come in and we kind of go off the record. So that might be a great time if somebody wants to stay on and do that. And
okay, so we'll do that for the off the record part.
Yep, and then Josh actually gave me so if I could get a quick answer from you, just because I said it on the recording already. He
Sure.
said his main character's primary conflict is overcoming the grief of his wife's death, which prevents him from the mission before him. So he's asking, can that be the primary conflict, and then other characters trigger the responses?
Oh, absolutely. That's a fantastic conflict, and that's one where, gosh, you could bring the setting into it. I mean, this character, how many of us, if we've lost a loved one, we'll hear a song that just brings it right back. I mean, I lost my mom here several years ago, and years and years ago when I was little, my parents were divorced and we lived with my dad, and so we didn't see my mom nearly as much as I would have liked to. But I remember one weekend, she and my aunt were just singing, and my mom was singing the song Blue Bayou, which of course Roy Orbison did it, and the version she did was maybe a little more like Linda Ronstadt's. But for whatever reason, 9-10-year-old me, that just really is etched into my memory, and that song has always been associated with my mom. Well, I'm almost a 50-year-old man, and my mom's been gone for, oh gosh, more than a decade anyway. And I heard that song and just, found myself tearing up and puddling up because I associate that with her. Well, your character can be in the grocery store and hear a song, or they can be at work, and another character can, of course, trigger those emotions, and that's a fantastic primary source of conflict. But you don't want to limit it to just that conflict. Keep piling things on, or keep approaching that same conflict from different directions. So hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, I think that was good. Okay, so let's go on another 5 or so minutes with the rest of this. And then we'll wrap it up for the recording, and then we'll go into the after party. And I think that'll be fun to kind of hear how with people live.
Fantastic. So are we okay then to go ahead and just kind of do a map? Or, I mean, we don't have to write it down because I don't know how to use the whiteboard. But let's put a scene together, a 5-minute scene. Let's put something together real fast and just kind of let's see how much conflict we can throw in a character. Anybody throw me a genre, any genre.
YA fantasy.
What's that? YA fantasy. Okay, that's perfect for conflict. Okay, now somebody else give me a main character. Just a basic idea for a character. Okay, a postal worker. I like that. Joshua. Okay, we have a dwarven postal worker in YA fantasy. And the postal worker, he needs to deliver something. We'll say it's the MacGuffin that is going to save the day. But what gets in his way? What's in between him and delivering the MacGuffin?
His vehicle breaks down.
His vehicle breaks down. Okay, we'll say it's fantasy. We can do anything. He's got a helicopter that's powered by bird power, and that breaks down. And so if someone says a vicious dog. Now, his helicopter crashes, that's okay. He can still get to where he's going. A vicious dog. The mailboxes are opposed to receiving the mail. Why not? It's fantasy. All of a sudden, the evil wizard animates the mailboxes, and the mailboxes themselves are fighting our poor dwarf, and we probably ought to give this guy a name. We're going to call him Unlucky the Dwarf, because he's sounded pretty unlucky by now. Okay, well, what other things can we do? What's a character that could cause a conflict for him? Those are all great conflicts. The deliveries in a high-rise, there's a burly security guard, all right? And that mean dog ripped off his uniform patch, and so the guard is not buying that he is a legitimate postal delivery worker. He's convinced that he's trying to storm the tower. And so this is just not working for him. It's another layer of conflict. And then what can the natural environment do? What can make this even more difficult? And of course, this is fantasy fiction, so we can go way out. Earthquake, okay, that's laser storm, all right. An earthquake, mudslide, laser storm, I like it. Okay, an earthquake causes a mudslide. Okay, our poor dwarf isn't very tall to begin with, and now he's up to his nose in mud, and then what happens? It starts raining, but it's not just raining, it's raining lasers. Oh my gosh, this guy's in conflict, and to make it worse is that the burly guy doesn't seem to be hindered by it at all, and he's still going to stand in his way. The mailboxes have gone crazy, and they're trying to kill, and he's got the MacGuffin, and then what happens? Somebody else wants the MacGuffin. The package comes open because of the mud, yeah, and then somebody sees it, and sure enough, somebody sees it, what they want it, and they're probably going to get it. So we've already, his mother, oh gosh, yeah. Not only does this guy have to deliver the thing, but he's late for his mother's birthday party, and we know the mail has to all go out before he can quit for the day. What if the package comes alive? Oh my, yeah, that would be some delicious conflict. Okay. What are some other characters we can add in? We got the burly security guard who doesn't want him to get into the building. He knows it's her last birthday. Okay, well, how does he know that? Did some kind of a sage tell him that? Well, maybe the sage is lying. Maybe the sage has some kind of other agenda. Well, you know, how can we add conflict? How can we add layers? Go ahead.
A competing postal worker made up the lie so that he would win a route or something.
Yes, a jealous colleague. I love that. Somebody else is mad because he gets to deliver the MacGuffin. Why should he deliver the MacGuffin? I've been working at the post office for 175 years, doggone it. And another customer just wait to visit and tie up his time. Right, because he's already late, and you know, there's somebody that's very well intentioned, and hopefully she's also very sweet, and he would be a complete jerk if he just cut the conversation off. So he can't get where he wants to get because there's conflict. There's something stopping him from getting where he wants to go. And it just kind of gives you just a little idea of what what you can do with conflict. His best friend calls Matt. He's allergic to mud, this poor guy. He's breaking out. Okay. If somebody tells him everything he's doing is wrong, well, at this point, it probably is. Early in the story, most of the things your characters should do should be wrong. Now, the exception is you should show them being good at something so that readers will relate to them and they won't just be pathetic. But most of the things that they try to do to take care of their problem should go wrong in all kinds of bad ways. And until you get to the point where you're just about ready to resolve the conflicts and go on the downslope of the story. So hopefully that was fun. I mean, we could go on all day with that. I mean, I could spend a whole hour just doing scenarios like that, and I think it would be fun. Oh no, the poor guy's going to have to climb 10 stories breaking out from the mud. This was fun, guys. And like I said, I would love to do a dozen of these just like that, just throwing out and putting characters together. And I don't know that this dwarf story is going anywhere because it seems a little over the top. But if there's any aspiring young adult fantasy fiction writers, feel free to take that one. That one's free.
Okay, that was great. All right, so everyone who's with us live, if you want to stay, we're going to go ahead and wrap up for the recording purposes, and then we'll have everybody come in. And then if you've got questions for Scott and want to do more of these, we totally can for probably the next 10 or so minutes. So Melissa, I'll turn it over to you. And so everyone, thank you so much for watching. Scott, thank you for being here. This was super fun.
Thank you.
Melissa,
And again, check out Danny's Inferno. You can get it at Amazon or any place where you buy books.
awesome. Yes, we will. We'll make sure the links go in as well when we post this too.
Perfect.
Finally, Melissa, anything else, or Norma, anything else before we go off the recording?
Oh yeah, our next guest that's coming up is going to be Peggy Sue Wells talking about right to rest.
Oh, very
So,
good.
looking forward to that.
All right, we'll see you guys.
Sounds like a needed counterbalance after ramp up the conflict.
Conflict.
Yes.
We're going to need rest.
Right.
Thanks, Scott. We love
Thank
you.
you
Scott.
so much for having me.